The Westpac-Melbourne Institute Index of Consumer Sentiment increased by 1.5% in July. The survey was taken over the period July 5 to July 9, when Sydney was in lockdown and restrictions were prevalent in regional New South Wales. But it came before the tightening of restrictions that were announced late on July the 9th. The Sydney Sentiment Index was down 13.6% and New South Wales overall was down 10.2%. So why did the index not fall substantially? Well, it was fully offset by strong rises in the other states, in particular Victoria, that was up 10.5%, and Western Australia 15%. And we know, of course, that Victoria and Western Australia, that were down sharply in June, rebounded in their confidence once their economies reopened after the lockdowns that they experienced in June. The level of confidence in Sydney and New South Wales is still quite high, 108 in Sydney and 105 in New South Wales. But of course, what we have to remember is that last year, in July to September, confidence in Sydney and New South Wales was down at 88, and they weren't locked down at the time. But there was a substantial fear that the difficulties that Victoria was facing may have spread to the rest of the country. So we have to be prepared for the possibility that the indexes will fall further in New South Wales. And of course, that will depend upon the length of the lockdown, whether we see more extreme tightenings of conditions. And we will see how that plays out over the next few weeks. That 13.6% fall in Sydney can be compared with the 7.6% fall we saw during the lockdown associated with the Northern Beaches concern back in January. There was some good news around certain parts of the economy. In particular, we saw a 17% jump in the confidence of tradespeople. And that, of course, is reflecting the strength that we're seeing in the home building sector and the renovation sector. And of course, we know at this stage, building sites in Sydney and the rest of New South Wales have not closed down, so that confidence could be sustained for some time. The second insight was the Westpac-Melbourne Institute Index of Unemployment Expectations. That index was largely unchanged and is still holding at near a 10-year high. However, in New South Wales, the index fell by 16.7%. But bear in mind that last month, it was coming off a 20-year high. This was offset by strong recoveries in other states. So we saw a 5.8% lift in employment confidence in Victoria, a 7% lift in Queensland, and a 13% lift in Western Australia. And all of those levels remain at around 10-year highs for those three states. The survey also gives us insights into the housing market. And the question, is now a good time to buy a dwelling, was flat for the month. Bear in mind that it is 26% below the peak that we saw in November. And what that's telling us is that owner-occupiers and first home buyers still remain challenged by the weakening affordability that we're seeing as a result of the sharp rise in prices. However, there was no change in that index for New South Wales. And what that's also telling us is that whereas we've seen sharp falls in confidence in New South Wales associated with the lockdown, respondents tend to separate that out from prospects for the housing market. We saw further evidence of that when the outlook for house prices was flat for the month, and indeed in New South Wales it was up slightly. So despite the lockdown, confidence in the housing market in terms of house prices remains very strong. The Reserve Bank Board next meets on August the 3rd. We don't expect any change in policy settings after we saw the major changes in the July board meeting, but we will see their adjusted forecasts for the economy. They'll have 3 more weeks to assess the extent of the lockdown and whether there are further tightenings in New South Wales and of course whether the virus spreads to other states. But at this stage, I think they'll be seeing things in a similar light to the factors that Westpac is looking at the moment in terms of the overall impact of the lockdown. The first point is that we've learned from lockdowns, as we saw in Victoria and Western Australia in today's survey, is that once the lockdowns finish, you have a very strong rebound. So if we do see some loss of activity in the September quarter, a lot of that can be expected to be gained back in the December quarter. We've also seen a strong response from government in supporting jobs, and whilst not quite as generous as the JobKeeper package of $750 a week, the $600 has still been well received. Other factors that are going to be important in assessing the impact on the national economy will be the booming conditions we're seeing in other states at the moment, and of course the very strong momentum that New South Wales enjoyed as we went into the lockdowns. And we have to remember that most retail is still open in New South Wales, and construction sites are still open as well. So these are factors that we'll look at in terms of assessing the overall impact of the current lockdowns on the economy. But of course there are downside risks, most importantly potential for the spreading of the Delta strain to other states. We also have to accept that the prospect of an early reopening appears to be diminishing, and we also have to be concerned of further tightening of current regulations. So there are a number of positives in terms of how we should be assessing the overall impact upon the economy, but some offsetting negatives. In terms of putting numbers on all of this, as we saw last year when the early estimates were so wildly inaccurate in terms of the overall impact of the virus, I think it's better to wait to see how the virus pans out over the next few weeks before we should be putting any estimates on the total impact on the growth and the activity in the economy. Thank you.